Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. I'm so pleased that you could join us wherever you're tuning in from. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon on the West Coast here. It is about 12 noon. Thank you so much from Royal Roads University. My name is Ariana Kinjerski. I am an education specialist at Royal Roads. Here with some wonderful people, and we're here today to talk about higher education in the era of artificial intelligence, leading to leverage the benefits of generative AI, of course, brought to you by our Masters of Arts in Higher Education Administration and Leadership program. And I'm pleased today to be joined by our school director, Dr. Tamara Leary, and also regards from Dr. Robin Mueller, who is the program head, who couldn't be here today, but we send her well wishes. Before we get going here for our session, I'd just like to acknowledge our traditional lands at Royal Roads University. We, of course, acknowledge the campus is located on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. We're deeply grateful to be able to work and play on these lands. So thank you all so much for joining us. Before we get going, I'd just like to give a little bit of an introduction to our wonderful panelists today. So we have several folks joining us from all across Canada. Brenna Clark-Gray, who's the coordinator of educational technologies at Thompson Rivers University. We have Nick Baker, who's the director, Office of Open Learning at the University of Windsor. Nancy Turner, who is the associate vice provost, teaching and learning at the University of Saskatchewan. And of course, these folks will be introducing themselves in greater detail, but we're very pleased that they could join us today. So thank you all so much for being here. And at this point, I will not keep you waiting any longer. We'll go ahead and get started with our discussion today. And I'll pass it off to Dr. Tamara Leary to go ahead and kick us off. Tamara.
Thanks so very much, Ariana. Thank you everyone for joining us. We truly appreciate your interest in the topic in Royal Roads University and of course in the Masters of Arts in Higher Education Administration and Leadership. So my job here today is to just moderate the panel a little bit, so I don't have a whole lot to say. If you have any questions, either while the panelists are speaking or perhaps after they're done and we move to before we move to another section, if you would like to pop questions in the chat, we will get to them that way. So let's get underway. I think before we get into the actual question we've asked our panelists to think about, perhaps each panelist could introduce themselves and tell us why this particular invite to be part of this panel was something that intrigued them, that they were interested in participating. So let's start with Brenna.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much for having me here. My name is Brenna Clark-Gray, and as already noted, I'm coordinator of educational technologies at Thompson Rivers University, located in beautiful Tk'emlúps te Secwepemc territory within the unceded traditional lands of Secwepemc Ulu, where I'm a grateful and certainly uninvited visitor. I'm in a faculty role here. I'm a tenured faculty member who's recently been reappointed, effective this summer, as a research professor in the Department of Learning, Design, and Innovation. And I'm very interested in how CARE is both manifested and co-opted in the work of educational technologies. And more specifically with AI, I'm interested in how we align our institutional values. Particularly, I'm very interested in sustainability and equity policy with our technological practice. I think very often we treat technology as this like separate thing from all those core values. And with the rise of generative AI in particular, I think it's really difficult to ignore the impact of these technologies on things like sustainability and equity. And so that's of major concern to me. When I was first asked to be on this panel, I kind of thought I maybe shouldn't be because I'm not particularly known as an enthusiast of AI, and I'm not in the leadership space, but I'm hoping that I can offer some perspectives that will be useful today.
Thank you, Brenna. Well, we're thrilled that you did accept the invitation. Nick.
Thanks, Tamara, and thanks everyone for the invitation as well. I come at this from a background. I'm the Director of Open Learning at the University of Windsor down here in Southern Ontario. You'll see the Southern Ontario sun coming through the background here. It's hitting me in the face. And my institution is a fairly conservative, smaller institution. We're trying to figure out where we sit in this space. But my background is many varied things, but most recently in educational development and educational technology. I have worked a lot in the distance education space and also in open educational practices, as well as accessibility and access roles. So for me, I'm really interested in how AI intersects with those things, particularly around how it has the potential to improve access for students who have disabilities, students who are racialized, who are international students, and what it means for them both as a potential positive and as a potential risk with those student groups. And also from our perspective, we're interested in how this will impact disciplines and the research process, and that there is not a lot of great guidance or a lot of leadership on this at this point in many parts of the world. So as someone who kind of studies leadership in higher education and how we express ourselves, I'm fascinated to see the kind of void that exists at the moment in many places. So I'm happy to be there and happy to be here and chat.
Thank you, Nick. Nancy.
Thanks very much. I'll certainly echo just the gratitude for being invited to be here and be part of this conversation with wonderful colleagues. As already mentioned, Nancy Turner. serve as the Associate Vice Provost of Teaching and Learning at the University of Saskatchewan, which is located on Treaty 6 territory, the homeland of the Métis. I'm actually today joining you from Arizona, however. Just wanted to be clear as to why I've got beautiful sunshine behind me. Although we do have beautiful sunshine in Saskatchewan most of the time, it's often, paired with a -40. So I'm grateful to be down here. I'm actually here for a global research alliance in artificial intelligence in education and learning conference. So this was very timely in terms of it's been stimulating a lot of my thoughts over the last couple of days. So just want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Arizona, which is the traditional lands of the Otham and the Pipik people. So I think my key interest in this topic and really, again, just over a year of being immersed in thinking about generative artificial intelligence in the higher education context really comes out of an interest in how we can navigate some of the immediate challenges and concerns, how we can leverage these tools that are available to improve teaching and learning. Something that I think we're not particularly good at as a higher education sector. So thinking about what kinds of external forces, and certainly generative artificial intelligence is a massive one, can actually be catalysts for change, rethinking, starting really good conversations and dialogue about what we do, why we do it, and what we might do differently in response to some of these tools. Always very much in a context of thinking about them quite critically. I'm certainly not a proponent of technology for technology's sake, only when it can actually serve our broader goals. I think sometimes these kinds of developments, and particularly this at a global scale, allows us to ask really good questions that we sometimes just subvert or don't face in terms of what's the purpose of higher education, what's the purpose of instruction and assessment, particularly being disrupted in this time. But also thinking about what's the purpose of teachers and teaching, and what does all of that mean in this new context of generative artificial intelligence. So all of those questions and the dialogue around them, not presuming I have any kind of answers to them, But that is really exciting to me because much like in the pandemic, it opens up those opportunities for really deep and meaningful discussion and debate. And I think that's what I'm really excited about. And that was really what got me very excited when I was invited to be part of this wonderful panel. So that's looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nancy. Thank all of you. So we definitely have the right people in place here, and you each have offered a lovely segue into the question that we asked you. So as you've all indicated, generative AI is here very much in the Canadian higher education landscape, and it's going to stay. I think we can all agree that it's going to stay. How it will stay continues to be, to your point, a lot of discussion, a lot of research. Some people are thrilled, some people are less thrilled. It can be reassuring. It can also drive anxiety to heights that we didn't know possible. So the question we asked each of you to share your perspective on, what leadership approaches or strategies or possibly practices do you feel have been effective for leveraging the benefit from artificial intelligence in post-secondary education, as opposed to our defaulting to surveillance? So let's start with, let's go backwards. Let's start with you, Nancy.
Fantastic. And what a great question. I think that's one of the things that I find really fascinating about all of the discussion around generative artificial intelligence is it's making us ask better questions as well. Anyway, I think that starting question is a really great one. And I certainly, when I was reflecting on the question and thinking about how to respond, could think of a lot of things that maybe we as a university didn't do as well as we could have. So I'm trying to focus in on learning from some of those things, but focusing in on the things that I thought actually were helpful. I ended my little intro by talking about the really big questions that I think generative artificial intelligence brings us to look at and actually have meaningful debate around and discussion around. That's not where we started. And I think the reason we didn't start there was because there was an immediate need in January, as the academic term was starting after the launch of ChatGPT, to really deal with the immediate concerns of faculty, which were really focused on assessment and integrity related to assessment. And should we allow these tools to be used? Should we not? Can we ban them? And, kind of everything from, isn't this a great tool, a response? And I'm really excited to dive into it with my students, to how do we ensure that nobody ever touches this thing, and kind of everything in between. So really, as all of us were, that was the context that we were navigating, and we needed to be able to respond very quickly to those very immediate concerns. So thinking about some of the really big key decisions around, do we allow use? Are we looking at banning it? Which we know very few sectors or institutions actually did. And we were certainly of the mind that after lots of connection and discussion with others as well outside of our institution, but that this wasn't something that was bannable, that we needed to actually engage and think about its use, but that we needed to have some broad level kind of guidelines, and we needed to have those really quickly. We needed to actually have them really simple and really clear. And those were kind of some key things that we, at the outset, really, this was early January 2024, that we were really trying to come up with those things. And part of that was also being clear about where we thought decisions appropriately lay within the institutional kind of structures. And so part of what we did was actually look at, okay, so we can have some broad guidelines and guideposts and boundaries perhaps as an institution, but this is actually an academically driven decision in terms of whether engagement and use of these kinds of tools is going to be a barrier to learning, or whether it can actually be leveraged to enhance learning. So we were quite, I think, early on putting that decision making at the level of the faculty member, and being very clear that that was where it needed to lie, because there was so much differentiation across our courses, and we needed that to really be academically grounded and academically driven in terms of the decisions that were made. But then we needed to have the guidelines around, student privacy and use of the tools and what could they be used for, not used for. And those were more institutional decisions to kind of lay that out, again, as simply and as clearly as we possibly could. So that was really the immediate kind of response, and then that communication across the institution related to that. And recognizing that in order to support faculty in making those decisions at the local level, we then had to have conversations and dialogue that helped them come to understand the tools better, what the tools actually did, how they functioned, and then make appropriate decisions within their context. And that's challenging as for all of us when you've got an institution where you've got thousands of instructors across multiple kind of different disciplines and contexts, trying to navigate that. So those educational materials, resources available just in time, lots of dialogue. And one of the things that we did around, education, aside from some of those resources that we made available very quickly, and we were pointing to lots of resources elsewhere because we were all doing the same kind of work in generating this, and drawing on those other examples was also very helpful. And very practice-based rather than conceptual in nature, which is the bigger questions that come later. But also we tried to really do a lot of our educating to shift the focus from where the problem lie. Is the problem with our students? Is the problem with our structures and our curricula? And that was a really kind of key part of the dialogue, is reshifting the focus. Are we trying to prevent the students from doing something, or are we trying to change our systems and structures in order to enable learning in the ways that we want? And so that was a huge kind of, again, just trying to shift the dialogue a bit and trying to shift the conversation. We also took a strategy, and again, I know this will be common in many places, to have this dialogue at the department level. So not with individual faculty coming together from multiple different contexts, although we did have some of those as well. But we really prioritized and tried to dive into working in at the department level. So bringing together groups of people with academic leaders at the department to talk about what it meant in their context, for their program, for their particular outcomes and what they were trying to achieve with their students. And we did that, again, based on research, knowing that this is really where assessment and instructional practices are developed, where they are often entrenched, but also where they can be changed. The assumptions, the beliefs, the power structures, the resources that are used are all really focused at that work group level. And so being able to go in and facilitate dialogue at that level was really a core part of the strategy early on in terms of trying to help support the conversation. And those conversations really needed to be critical. So we had to not only think about what the opportunities were, but very much what the challenges were in use of these tools as well, both in terms of potentially being barriers to learning, but also in terms of privacy, in terms of how our data would be utilized, what uses could fall within appropriate use and what were offside. And so all of those kind of discussions happening. And just the last couple of points that we tried to do very early on was really look for fairly early, after we did that immediate response to help with those kind of immediate and pressing concerns, started to look for opportunities for people to play with the tools as well. So we brought in some pilots where we had trying to use the tools for good in terms of actually enhancing our teaching and learning practices, helping to facilitate better learning, particularly where there are tasks that are much more difficult to do in a large class or higher education context where you've got a lot of diverse learners. How can we actually leverage these tools to do what we know will actually help facilitate learning, but is very difficult to do from a resourcing point of view in our higher education structures. And so being able to come in and play with some of those in kind of isolated pilots so that we could start to talk about that and again, change the dialogue a little bit. So we kind of had three buckets of work: that immediate assessment work, which is definitely going to continue on, but was most pressing. And we'll need to think about how we change our assessment now going forward. The second one was, how do we leverage these tools for teaching and learning and to improve teaching and learning? And now we're moving into that third one, which is more around curriculum, which is some of those bigger questions that we're starting to have now around what does this mean for higher education? What does this mean for how we need to prepare our students for a future where generative artificial intelligence will be something that they have to encounter in their work likely, and how can we give them the skills to critically engage with that, to ethically engage with that, and to utilize these tools in meaningful ways, or make choices appropriately so at times not to engage in use of these tools. And so how do we actually help support students to do that? And of course, to do that, we have to support our faculty to have those skills as well, so that they can think about it critically in their context. So those are a few of the things that we're doing. And again, on a kind of timeline of a year, the strategies have changed over that year based on what's most pressing and what we need to really help support our faculty to do.
Thank you, Nancy. Nick, do you want to go next?
Sure. And I could echo a lot of the things that Nancy has talked about in terms of approaches. One of the things I think was different for a little different for us was that oftentimes people will default to, well, what's the policy? And in this space, there's really not opportunity for policy in the way that we typically imagine it. There are some examples of how you could develop policy that was forward-looking enough, or that was broad enough to capture some of the issues that people were concerned about. But for the most part, you're not going to have a policy that says this is exactly how you can use AI and this is what's going to happen, because it's just changing so rapidly. So one of the things that we did do was look at all of our existing policies and pretty quickly determined that if the concern with students was around academic misuse of those tools, that we had policy in place that would serve that function. And we tried very hard to shift the conversation from being solely focused on student academic misconduct to ethical and responsible use of these tools across our campus community. So it took a long time to shift that conversation from how do we catch cheating students to how do we imagine it working in our discipline. So kind of like Nancy's conversation around curriculum, we're having the same thing at the discipline level for faculty, imagining how it works in their research context, and also with staff, how are they imagining it being used in their everyday work. There's been some really interesting things that have happened over the last few days, last couple of weeks in AI, big things that are happening constantly. But, if you look at the world of work, there's a large global survey that was released earlier in the week that 92% of Canadian HR leaders are already incorporating AI into their hiring practices. So that's a kind of literacy that our students will need to be able to navigate that space. And as much as we may not want that to be the case, it's the reality of the world that they're going into. So we've been talking a lot about what literacy means, and what literacy in AI means, and whether that is a subset of digital literacy or whether it's actually something quite different because it incorporates a number of things that are not just about digital technologies. There's a whole lot of ethical understanding that goes with decision making around the use of AI that we've been trying to make visible, I think. And one of the other things that we've been trying to do in the Ontario sector is have a broader conversation within the sector here about what our values as a group of higher education institutions might be, and where we see opportunities for us to work together on providing perhaps equitable and more safe access, rather than relying on very large and very expensive current partners to provide that for us. We know that we're basically priced out of that market for most institutions at present, but we can't ignore that we need to have access to these tools to be able to evaluate them appropriately, to figure out what the risks are in our context. And so we've been thinking about how we might collectively work together on the open side of that, where we see much more benefit to the institution and to society. And of course, a couple of days ago or yesterday, there was an announcement about the AI Alliance, which sounds terrifying when it's led by Meta and IBM. But if you look down the list, there's actually a whole lot of good partners in there that are important, I think, in that conversation. For us, the other thing that we've been really focusing on is two things. One is, what's the value of this for supporting students from an accessibility point of view? So we know that students are already using it and it's changing their lives because it's providing the kind of accessibility support that they have never received in their higher education careers. And the other is, if that's the case, how do we provide equitable access to students and staff and faculty that's safe and affordable for our institutions? It's not going to bankrupt our institutions trying to do this. And how do we ensure that we avoid perpetuating the digital divide? I think one of the challenges in policy development and in the way that institutions have approached this, largely because, as Nancy pointed out, we had to have a response quickly, is that many voices were excluded from those early conversations. And what we really need is to get these AI tools into the hands of marginalized groups, of women, of young people, of people of color, of low-income communities, of First Nations communities, and help them, support each other to figure out how to use those ethically and how we can support all of society to use them appropriately. So I think we have all of the same issues around how do we manage this in a curriculum point of view, but those are some of the additional things that we've been focusing on here that I think are important.
Thank you, Nick. Brenna.
Hi, thanks. Before I begin my reflections on this topic, I do want to just take a second to acknowledge that it is December 6th, and we are just about the time of in sort of alignment with when the Polytechnic massacre happened. The National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women is today, and like many women my age, I grew up in the shadow of the École Polytechnic massacre. I've never known a time when the existence of post-secondary education in this country was divorced from gender-based violence. And December 6th made me both terrified to call myself a feminist for many years, and it also made me assert my feminism more urgently for many, many more. And the reason why I think it's relevant to our discussion today is that discussions of equity and access are never anodyne. They're never neutral. And the costs are both concrete and specific. And we have a very clear example of that in our history. So as a panel, we've been asked to respond to a shared prompt. And as I noted off the top, while far from an AI enthusiast, I do believe that the most significant position leadership at universities and colleges can take right now is to establish a shared culture of both radical transparency and disclosure around AI use. I'm going to share my qualms and concerns with you today. I'm nothing if not comfortable in the role of the Luddite Debbie Downer in this space. I enjoy it very much. But my day-to-day work is hands-on peer-to-peer faculty support. So I'm very aware of the need to address uses of these tools and support faculty in their work. I'm just going to share with you in the chat the resource that our team built for Thompson Rivers University, which centers on classroom ideas, suggested syllabus language, practices of collective expectation setting, and open discussion about these technologies. And it's really an ethos we wanted to share from the beginning when we rolled out our first sort of responses as a campus support team. So we always start these conversations from this notion of like, it's here and we can't do anything about it, so let's embrace it. And I am actually going to push back against the discourse of inevitability here. I still believe there are big ethical questions to be debated about the appropriateness of generative artificial intelligence in the post-secondary space at all. While Sarah Eaton has coined the term post-plagiarism to talk about the relationship between generative AI and academic writing, I would argue instead that these technologies are para-plagiarist. They exist only because of a widespread acceptance of a dissolution of the concept of intellectual property, citing sources, tracing arguments that academic thinking has traditionally been based upon. It's a move. It's a gigantic move in society. And we have not always, as a university structure, accepted that mainstream notions of what is acceptable in the process of writing are acceptable in the process of university writing. But for some reason this time we seem to be happy to do that. And I'm kind of fascinated by that dynamic. Likewise, we know well now that the conclusions reached by AI and generative AI tools are often steeped in the same kind of issues of racism, ableism, misogyny as any other tools designed in a flawed society and based on the kinds of data sets we have access to. And so, when we see those huge numbers of HR professionals embracing generative AI, I have so many follow-up questions to that study. And I worry because I don't see those questions necessarily being asked, which speaks to Nick's excellent point about who is invited into the conversations around these technologies, but also who is invited into the conversation around technological procurement at your university generally, the collective you. I think we really need to think about, for many, many years, we've treated technology as the fixtures and fittings of the university, rather than as tools that may reinscribe or not our values and our ethics as an institution. We know that harms are reinscribed by these technologies. So we do have a moral obligation to figure out how to reduce those harms before we come to rely on these tools as part of practice. And traditionally, we actually like to do it the other way around. So algorithmic text proctoring, for example, right? Let's roll it out to as many students as possible and then recognize that there are significant harms associated with the technology. And then we really have to be honest about the fact that as universities, we do often have the conversation of, well, this much harm is okay. We're comfortable with this much harm to our students. We don't like to say it out loud, but those are decisions we make around technology all the time. Just as urgently, I think we're increasingly aware of the large carbon footprint and the shocking water use of these technologies. As someone who lives and works in a fire-ravaged desert, understanding the costs of these tools shapes my practice with them dramatically. But the reality is, as much as I'm laying these out right at the beginning of our discussion today, we can't have those conversations if we don't know who is using the tools or why, or if we turn the question of AI use into one of policing and prosecution, as we largely have done with academic integrity more generally, right? Like, I'm not here to advocate for yet another Turnitin style arms race that we will inevitably lose, as we lost the Turnitin style arms race with the advent of contract cheating. This moment is best addressed by whole community standards, where all faculty, staff, and students are actually held to the same expectations of disclosure and citation. That's what it means to have a culture of academic integrity. So many of our institutions say we have a culture of academic integrity, when what we really have is a rule book for only students to follow. But a true culture of academic integrity would hold faculty, staff, and students all to the same standards and expectations when it comes to using these technologies. Anyway, I look forward to discussing all of this more with the panel today. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Brenna. And thank you, Nick and Nancy as well. There definitely are some commonalities, some common themes from what you're saying in terms of the importance of that, ethical frame, having the right people at the table, that policy isn't necessarily practice, that if policy is informing our practice, then what is our policy? And, you each brought or emphasized the importance of equity and accessibility and fairness, and all posed questions as well. So we've got a couple questions coming through in the chat there now. Are panelists comfortable with my just kind of reading them and you can jump in? That's okay? All right. So, and let's see, a couple of comments, great comments. So Darren asks, right now, most AI tools are only accessible for use by users who are signed into an account, and therefore prompts are tied to that identity and retained within that corpus of content used to train the AI or enterprise. Customers can pay an unknown amount of money to OpenAI for a license that sandboxes the AI and protects prompts and output from being used to train the future AI iterations. The question is, has higher education, and perhaps education overall, pressured OpenAI, Google, Meta, etc., for the same privacy and intellectual property protections for students and academics there seems like a huge gap in AI policy. Which one of you might like to make a comment?
I can lead it off, and
That would
I'm
be
sure
great, Nick.
my
Thank you.
colleagues will jump in as well. I can say it varies a lot around the world. So what's happening here in North America is quite different to the kinds of pressures that have been applied in the UK or Australia or Europe particularly. In the North American context, you're right. And I think the other thing that we should point out is that most of the AI tools are only available in the UK and US context at the moment, without kind of doing things that get you around some of the geo blocks that exist at the moment. So I think that is actually a huge problem for us to face. And it is one of the things that pushes us towards thinking about, well, should we actually be sandboxing these tools at an institutional or a provincial or a national level that would get us around some of those other challenges that you've noted so in the question. And I think that that's actually probably the smartest thing that we could do. I think you're also seeing in the list of collaborators in the AI Alliance that I mentioned earlier, a response to the issues that people are seeing with Microsoft owning such a huge chunk of the AI world at present. And I think we're only at the tip of what that might mean for us all. But at the moment, even with Microsoft, if you can afford to pay for the tools, then they are sandboxed within your Microsoft tenant. So their commitment to us so far is that content doesn't get used to train their larger models. It's used to refine your local model, which is then theoretically at least contained within the institution. That's yet to be seen, though, whether that, how long that sticks around like that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Nick. Brenna, Nancy, anything to add?
So I'm just waiting to see if anybody, if you were going to unmute, Brenna. No, I think that was a great summary. I do think that the idea of infrastructure, of privacy, of how do we ensure that use of these types of tools is not breaching, well, I think radically, this actually, the advent of generative artificial intelligence is going to cause us to completely rethink our idea of intellectual property and copyright, firstly.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are much bigger questions that our current kind of framing of those things just doesn't actually address. But I do think that from an ethical engagement and trying to protect student privacy, protect the intellectual property of our faculty colleagues and so forth, we are going to need to create kind of more walled gardens, if I would use a kind of lay term for what Nick so eloquently described. We're going to need to have ways to engage with these tools where what is put into them can be protected. I think that it will be problematic for us to just depend on big companies to provide us with that. I think we have to be really critical in engaging and thinking, and really, I think that's one great potential role for higher education, is to push for creation of tools and ways of engaging in these tools in ways that can actually protect the person who's actually doing the engagement. So I think that's going to be a big part of what we need to think about and look at over the next while. And we are not there yet. So we still need to be very thoughtful and careful in protecting anybody who's engaging in use of these tools. And I think educating people to make really good decisions about how they're engaging. And that would include our faculty colleagues as well as our student colleagues in terms of what that looks like, I think is going to be an incredibly important part of what we need to do as institutions and as a sector.
I do think also this is a good argument for collective action as universities. We will not win going alone against these massive companies. And, you know, something Anne-Marie Scott has written about in the procurement space is this idea that we treat the technologies that we have access to at the university as though they are some like piece of competitive advantage. And so we keep very secret what our agreements are, what the parameters around them are. First of all, it's foolish. We all have Microsoft. Okay. But second of all, it stops us from working together, and it stops us from collective demands and collective action against these kinds of companies, against which no individual university in Canada, with maybe a handful of exceptions, could possibly compete.
Thank you. Another question Andrea has posed: how do we best educate the students in understanding the difference between crafting their own work that evidences their unique critical and analysis skills? She comments that this work ultimately feeds the databases that will be used for AI as it searches other databases and uses the content therein. Similarly, in a business context, AI might be used to craft paragraph ideas or content to stimulate ideas for independently written reports. However, using the same AI source or an AI sourced art based on an artist's work without acknowledging that source of work might violate intellectual property or copyright laws. So she's asking, you know, what are your thoughts on how do we best educate the students in understanding that difference in crafting their own work that can reflects their own critical thinking, their own critical analysis? Brenna?
I like to start by saying it's not just students who need that educating. It's everyone within the university. The speed with which so many folks have reached for, frankly, deeply sketchy AI detectors on random websites online, and happily are just feeding student work through those tools without, well, first of all, without any acknowledgement of their privacy responsibilities, but second of all, without really understanding where that data is stored or how it's being further used. This is an issue of education for everyone across the board. So I think that's a critical piece. I also think, you know, there's been a lot of discourse around the idea that faculty ought to become like educators in prompt engineering in their disciplines, which I find wild. More wild the fact that there are people giving webinars because they've decided they're experts on it already. I find that wild too. You know, educational technologies are often this space where there's not really a way to like measure expertise. And so self-announced expertise happens a lot, which is, you know, fine. We are practitioners. We use the technologies. We have practices that are good and bad. But it's very early for anybody to be claiming expertise in the pedagogy of prompt engineering. And yet I see that a lot. And I also see administrative demands that faculty like get on that. And both of those seem unrealistic right now. I think this is where I come back to the need to really talk openly about what these technologies are, how they work, have a framework and a culture around discussing appropriate and inappropriate uses. So often when I do have conversations with students about any aspect of data privacy, the most common response I get back is a sense of frustration that they haven't been sort of given this information previously, that there's just been this sense throughout their academic careers that they don't care, and that they have been powerless in the choice of technologies they have access to for most of their careers. So here in BC, most students are dropped into a Google ecosystem as elementary or high school students. They have no real choice over that. And then when they find out what Google does with data, they're like, oh, great, thanks, right? And so I think that, you know, there are larger pieces to this. And I really like what Nancy has raised about this idea of like, a lot of our practices should be coming into question with the advent of these technologies. And I think in general, critical digital literacies are a big piece of that. And it's not only students who need to come up to speed in that space.
Thank you. Brenna, your response, and I'll just offer this before, in case Nick or Nancy want to also add to that, but a couple of questions here, because I'm going to try to get to all of them, so I'm going to summarize if I see a few of them that sound a little bit of the same or touching on the same types of issues, are talking about exactly what you just said, the idea that this isn't just students, it's not a one-way street, that there is opportunity here to reconsider some of our old teaching approaches and tools that, have been around a long time. Someone mentions, the idea of an essay. Is that still the most relevant form of an assessment? Are there ways to use AI constructively? So Rebecca suggests, if you use it to fully write a paper, that's considered cheating and plagiarism in the traditional sense. But if you use it to create a paper, for students to create a paper, and then have the students critically analyze that paper or find the errors within that paper, that might be an example of kind of flipping it. So definitely some examples and conversations, I think, echoing what you are all saying around this isn't an isolated issue to students. There's no one answer solves all. So perhaps some of your additional thoughts on, how do we get the right people at the table? How do we start to, identify bite-sized chunks, if you will, to start moving this forward? Because it's like trying to tinker with a moving train that's gaining speed. And we all know that it can't keep going at the speed with no direction that it is going. Thoughts?
I'll jump in quickly. I think there's a couple of ways to move this forward. One is that we need to recognize, again, as we started with, it's not just students who need to know this. This is impacting all aspects of the academic enterprise. So faculty, we know, are using it for research purposes. We know that they're using it for analyzing data. We know that they're using it to write articles. We know that they're using it to review each other's papers. So I think we just have to be honest. And I think it was Brenna made the point about transparency and transparency of practice. And I think that's a really important starting point for us. That's what I'm doing with my students. My students are working with AI, co-creating content, but what they're doing is revealing the process that they go through. And I think in doing so, we have a much more holistic view of what students are capable of, what they're thinking, how they're understanding the course material, how they're understanding our conversations, and where those gaps might be, because we're actually making it okay to not focus on the end product. We're making it okay to focus on how do you get from the starting point to this end point and beyond. And I think that's a really critical thing. So I'm actually hopeful that translates into some of our academic practice as well. I think one of the important starting points will be in convincing the journals and the scientific community that that's an important thing to do. We've been doing it in open publishing for some time now, but it's not the normal practice. Mm-hmm. Making visible all the messiness of the work that we do is not comfortable for most people, but that's the only way that we get to understand how you come from, that's the way that you work from being a novice to being an expert. That's the way that you see how the human development is happening. There are a couple of journals who have taken this on recently, who have openly had a call for people to use AI, but to make that process visible in the production. I just submitted to one of those recently, and the process at the moment, spoiler alert for anyone who thinks it's easy, it's actually not. It's a whole lot of work to use multiple AI models to get to what you could have written yourself at this point. But what it does do is reveal all sorts of novel connections that you may not have thought of. So there are some very interesting things that are possible as a result of that. And I think that's part of what being literate in this space is.
Thank you, Nick.
Great. Oh my gosh, so many different ideas. Such great questions and engagement as well. Few things, I'll just maybe build a little bit on what Nick was talking about in terms of process versus product. I think that's going to be a big shift for us in the assessment world as well as in the publishing world. I think we use product and have historically in westernized higher education used product as a proxy for a whole lot of things that has hidden all the messiness of the process. But the process is where the learning is. The process is where the competencies and the skills are. So we mask it with a product, and that's part of, at least at times, I think, why we see students kind of opting for, well, if what you want is product, I'll use the tools I've got at my disposal to give you the product. But we're not actually ever acknowledging or helping to support, or in fact, giving feedback on the process that gets you to that thing, because that's actually what we're trying to do in higher education. And we don't actually spend, and these are the kinds of things I think that that generative artificial intelligence helps us kind of bring to the fore. Like, let's talk about that. Let's talk about also the whole idea about individual work. Like, why do we privilege that over group work, over other kinds of collaborative endeavors, especially when we look at the problems of the world? Individuals are not going to be able to solve these by themselves. And I'm not suggesting that we don't need to also support individuals in developing competencies and skills, but collaboration is one of those. So if we just, again, I'm going to throw this out as a radical prompt, like, is generative artificial intelligence in fact a collaborator and a partner, rather than something that allows us to circumvent? Like, maybe we need to radically rethink what we expect out of an assessment process, and actually start to think about, in the same way that we've been trying to think about more collaborative processes and supporting students in doing that in our learning in higher education, think about how we leverage these tools as partners. And again, that doesn't mean you're not critical about your partner or what it does and all of the bias, just like you need to be that about yourself. But these are the kinds of big questions, I think, that actually we're going to be called to start to really think deeply about. And if generative AI can craft a paper, what is it that the paper actually represents for us that we think is essential in our learning? And what are the other ways in which we can actually allow students to demonstrate that? If in fact a tool can do something, is it the thing that we want to support students to do? And of course, we use it, again, often we use that product as a proxy for what we actually really want to support students to learn and be able to demonstrate. And we need to start to disentangle and really dive into those kinds of questions, to me, in order to navigate this successfully.
Mm-hmm.
And like, ultimately, these are questions of scale, right? The reason why we really like 5-paragraph essays in introductory composition courses is because those courses are huge and labor demanding, and those are easy to mark. That's why they developed as a form in the first place. And so to the extent that we want to see that kind of evolution and change taking place, we really need to have honest conversations about what we're willing to resource. You know, we have huge swaths of contingent faculty, under-resourced for professional development and overworked in terms of sections taught and time. My concern always when we start to talk about assessment redesign is that often becomes the responsibility of individual faculty members. It becomes this atomized responsibility. Some people do well and some people do poorly, instead of recognizing the larger systemic issues that underpin the poor choices we've been making up to this point, right? And so I just want to surface that, because I think it's really important to talk about that piece as well. And also the extent to which I think starting to talk about process over product is also about, somebody put a note about scaffolding, it's also about recognizing what students do and don't come to the university or the college with in hand already, and what we expect them to be able to do. You know, I taught composition at a community college for 9 years. That was my life before moving into ed tech. And we were explicitly told in the curriculum guidelines for those university transfer courses that we could not teach grammar or basic paragraph structure. Well, the vast majority of our students needed support developing basic grammar and paragraph structure, and we were disallowed from committing time to that in the classroom. So we really need to be thinking about the structural issues that have gotten us to the place where so many students are assigned like 2 exams and 1 essay in a class, and that we've decided that is some sort of marker of learning. You know, it comes back to the old thing, which is, you know, are we measuring what matters, or are we measuring what's easy to measure? And so often, everybody on this call knows we measure what's easy to measure.
Thank you. Excellent comments. I know that I'm just watching the time, and there are a couple of other comments and questions, again, just very much along the same line of the as the conversation has evolved here this afternoon about that the importance of, you know, bigger conversations, reframing. I think the responsibility, faculty, students, administrators, and Brenna, to your point, you know, institutions as a whole, to think about their resources, to think about, you know, what their positions are, how do they support faculty, students, administration, practitioners, because it's not just happening in the classroom either. I know that's what we're talking about today, but excellent. And there certainly seems to be great support for some sort of continued collaboration and conversation across the country and between institutions. Nick, you raised the importance of, you know, being able to have those collaborations and taking that initiative. Absolutely excellent. So I think what I will do, knowing that we are we have 5 minutes left, and I know that Ariane had a little bit of information about the Michiel program. But what I'm going to pose is that if anybody on the call today or listening to the recording has questions, I'm going to suggest that our panelists are open to, you know, receiving those and engaging in conversation, either, you know, individually or share as a group. I want to thank all three of you. This has been just absolutely thought-provoking and very engaging, and hats off to our participants, to our audience, for the continuous chat and conversation, questions, comments, and resources shared. Absolutely, I think, instrumental to doing exactly what the three of you talked about in terms of getting those conversations underway. So, Ariana, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, everybody. That was fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Brenna, for sharing that in the chat. I'm trying to capture as many resources as we can as we go along. So folks, if you're on the recording, so you don't miss out on anything here. I'm just going to reshare my screen real quick, and then I would like to give you some information, because of course at Royal Roads, we value open discussions like this in the classroom. So if you're thinking you'd like to maybe take your education further into one of our master's programs, just like to give you a little bit of information if you're looking at applying, how to do so. So if you're thinking about applying to the Michiel program, just a few quick steps. Of course, we have an online application fee, so that's $134.04. And then also we require some supporting documents, so things like transcripts, a personal statement, structured resume, and 2 letters of reference. The details on how to do all of this is on our website, so that will be shared along with the recording. And then we also have some admission requirements, of course. So at Royal Roads, one of my favorite parts when I speak about our institution is our standard and flexible admissions process. So standard admissions, of course, looks like a 4-year or comparable undergraduate degree from a recognized post-secondary institution, as well as a minimum of 3 years of relevant paid work experience within the higher education institutions, if you were looking at joining our Michiel program. We also have flexible admissions, of course. So to be considered, applicants would normally require a minimum of 7 years of work experience in higher education institutions. So public accredited colleges, universities, polytechnics. And of course, there is some fine print on those. Again, this is all on our website for your perusal. If you are thinking about any of this, we would love to chat with you. Some key dates, if you're looking at our next intake for the Masters of Arts in Higher Education, Administration and Leadership, the start date is June. There is still time. March is coming in hot, but the application deadline is March 10th, 2024. So you still have some time. If you're thinking about it, now is the time, my friends, and we would love to see you in the program. There, of course, are services that are available to you. We have financial aid and awards, so they offer things like loans, bursaries, scholarships. We know going back to school is a huge commitment, so we try to be as supportive as possible. Also, our enrollment services folks, they can be reached at learn.more@royalroads.ca if you have any questions about any of our programs. We'd love to hear from you. Also, the phone numbers on the screen here for both local and toll-free for North America. You can give us a call as well. And they can really help you narrow down your program options, answer questions about your application, or connect you with students and alumni, like some of the wonderful folks that are on this call. I saw some familiar names, so if that's you. Thank you for being here. And that about wraps us up for today, folks. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists. Thank you to Tamara for co-hosting. You're so wonderful. Always a pleasure to be in the room with you. I will be in touch, of course, with our recording. And if you have questions, folks, feel free to respond to that email. I'd love to hear from you as well. And I'll share all of our resources and everything that we learned today in the recording email and from the chat. So thank you again, everybody. And we wish you a wonderful day. Take good care.